I've written 2 books, but they've all been self-published. So I'm doing this one now through a proper publisher, the whole New York agent thing. The number one thing that she says is the differentiator between getting an amazing advance and getting your book out there and not is an email list. All the publishers care about is your platform. So I'm going to be talking today about how you can use going on podcasting to build your audience, something that I do for one of my businesses pretty regularly and heavily. And I look at podcasting or going on podcasts as the lazy way to build an audience, and I'll be talking about what that means. Okay, so quick context. One of my companies, my oldest company, Double Your Freelancing, started that back in 2011, 2012. Right now it's at about 51,000 email subscribers, adding about 40 to 80 new people a day, 40,000 people a month hitting the site, most of which I'm crap at SEO, so most of this is through what I'm going to be covering today. And it does well. Like in the last 4 weeks, it's done about $82,000, and that's just me with a part-time virtual assistant. So what I want to get at and why I want to kind of focus on these metrics are this could be a full-time job, but it's not a full-time job. This is basically an hour or 2 a week of my time, and the majority of my time spent on this business is by going on other people's podcasts. I get about 25 to 50 a year, and what I'm going to walk you through is how I go about getting on these different podcasts and what my plan is for going on somebody else's podcast, and hopefully you'll be able to learn from this and follow kind of what I'm doing in that sense. So when I talk about podcasting, I realize that, like, you know, when earlier, you know, when Eric and Kevin were talking about starting your own podcast, that's obviously an avenue. But one of the issues I think with running your own podcast is there's a lot of podcasts out there. I'm good friends with 2 people who run podcasting platforms. One is called Transistor, the other is Castos. Both of them are doing ridiculously well because everyone and their brother is starting their own podcast. So it can be hard to get actually be out there and be like another tree in a very big and growing forest. But when I talk about podcasting, I'm specifically talking about going on other people's podcasts and who already have an audience, who already have a lot of listeners, and dropping a lot of value to their audience with the intent of siphoning off people from their listenership to your own audience or your own email list. So what's the benefit? Well, the first thing is that what I'll be covering is how you can draw the right audience in with intent. So an issue that I'm going to be talking a lot about today is this really crappy model of going on a podcast, doing your little talk, and then saying at the end when people ask where can they find out more about, or where can the listeners find out more about you and what you're up to, you give them like a Twitter handle or a domain or something like that. So if you do this right, you can get people into a very intentionally designed lead magnet that will then bring them through an awareness funnel and then get them to hopefully become a customer or referral source for you. Other thing is, I do a lot of talks at conferences, and every talk that I've given, if you really peel back the layers, it started out as me going on a podcast and then getting introduced from that to somebody who runs an event and so on and so forth. So in terms of networking, I think going on podcasts is a great way to build up really a global network of people. And podcasting is also a great way to test out new content, refine how you say things. When you give 50 talks a year on a podcast that are pretty much all the same, by that 50th talk, you're pretty good at being able to explain a potentially tough idea pretty quickly and easily. Okay, so why podcast appearances are good. I hate guest posting because you need to write a bunch of stuff and go through an editorial process, whereas if I can go on a podcast and show up for half an hour and just ramble, that's a lot easier. So I think podcasting is a great way to get yourself in front of somebody else's audience and get a great backlink with very minimal prep work. Backlinks. The reason I get a good amount of traffic to my site is because I have a lot of very big domains linking to me. And a lot of these big domains are people who run podcasts or Mixergy.com or smartpassiveincome.com or any of these different sites. They all link to me, and then I get a lot of their kind of, again, I'm not an SEO, but a lot of their, there's an element of trust that's passed on when a big domain links to your website. Don't need to travel. Ask me sometime about what it's like going from Minneapolis to Bangkok to London in the span of 3 days. It's not fun, and I've done that doing the conference circuit, and I really like being able to sit at my house and get a lot of the same benefits without needing to get on a flight. Finally, the how to go part at the end of every podcast. So a lot of podcasters don't talk about this, but if you go and you're a guest on a podcast, there's always, when you click stop on recording, you talk with the host a bit, and you can ask for referrals, you can ask for introductions, and a lot of the network that I've grown over the years has been through the small talk that happens after recording wraps up. Okay, so step one, what can you offer? So this is a big thing that I want you to hopefully get something. If there's one thing that you take away, it's going to be this section. So I'm on the receiving end, a lot of people pitching me to go on my podcast. So I do have a podcast. It's had about 600,000 people listen to it over the last few years. I don't really do much of it anymore, but I still get a lot of people who are like, hey, I have, my boss should be on your podcast, and there's nothing of value in it for me, and I archive the email. Don't do this. Don't be the person who's like, hi, my name's Brennan. I own this website. I own this company. I'd love to have an opportunity to come on your podcast. There's nothing of value in this email. Whereas something like, my name's Brennan. I own this website. I have a 9-lesson crash course on pricing that has helped tens of thousands of freelancers. I'd love to come on your podcast and share some of the big takeaways that my students have learned with your audience. This is valuable. If I'm a host, I see this, I'm like, this guy knows, he's taught something historically before. He's potentially pretty good at teaching, I'm going to wager. And he has an agenda, which is what I want. I don't want just somebody who wants a share of my audience. I want somebody who's going to be giving something of value. These are the emails I respond to. These are the emails that lead to people going on a podcast. Whenever I go on a podcast, this is exactly what I do. What I also do is when I go on a podcast, and I'll talk about this in a bit, at the end, I link people to this email course. So when I mentioned a second ago, I have this 9-lesson crash course. It is this 9-lesson email course that is my primary lead magnet at my site. And what I do is I use this as leverage to get in front of other people's audiences. I'm not just going to say, hey, I'm a self-professed expert at so-and-so. Instead, I'm saying, I've got this thing. It's very well thought out. I'd love to send it to you. Can I send it to you? And I'd love to present, maybe one lesson of this, or maybe kind of a big picture overview of this to your audience. I think it would be helpful for them. If you want to get deeper into the building of an email course, I don't have time to. I don't know, PDFs are off, but that's fine. If you Google Growth Lab, which is Ramit Sethi's site, and then Brennan Dunn, there's a 9,000-word article that I wrote that's all about how to build or write stuff like this that automatically pitches people and all that stuff. I don't have time to get into this now, but check that out if you like the idea of building up an asset that you can use to get yourself on podcasts, but also promote something at the end of a podcast. It's more than check out my website. Okay. Second thing is when you know you have something of intent to share with an audience, find shared connections and pursue them. So my strategy is if I want to go on a podcast, I look to see who's been on that podcast and I see, do I know any of these people? So that is the biggest thing that I think, it's, I kind of hate saying this, but it really is who you know in everything when it comes to, especially podcasting. If you want to go on somebody else's podcast saying, I know this person, and I'm also going to have them intro me, goes a really long way compared to just a cold outreach email where you're kind of unannounced. What this can mean if you're starting out, like I did at one point, was you're going to not know many people at all. So you kind of want to start small and you want to say, oh, look, I know Eric because I've come to his events every week or every month. I'm going to ask him, he's been on this podcast. Hey, Eric, you've been on this podcast. I'd like to present on X. Do you think you could give me an intro? That's kind of stuff that you want to do until it kind of crescendos up, and eventually you're able to go on and say, hey, Seth Godin, you've had him on your podcast. Can he go on my podcast, or can I go on something that he's been on, or whatever else? Eventually, this is the kind of stuff that really does propel you to the point where you can go to just about any industry podcast and get yourself on it. When you do have these kind of shared connections, then your introduction becomes, hi, my name's Brennan. I've heard great things about your podcast from friends of mine who've been on your show. Then just name drop the hell out of the people that you know. And then you email everyone that you just mentioned and say, hey, Joel, how are things? Question, I saw you recently went on Janelle Allen's podcast. If you think I'd be a good fit, or if you think it'd be a good fit, could you email intro the two of us? I want to share some takeaways from whatever. Maybe fill in the blank of this could be a talk you gave at Marketers Anonymous. Went over well, you want to present that talk or a version of that talk on a podcast somewhere else. So you just rinse and repeat this again and again and again. Third step is, so once you've got like these, I can't go too deep, unfortunately, due to time constraints about all this, but once you've kind of gotten yourself on a podcast, the big mistake that I see people making is not, so, and I see this more so as somebody who has had guests on my own podcast, where a lot of people have a very specific spiel that they want to give. It's obviously a marketing thing that they are like, I want to promote my book, so I'm just going to go and do the podcast tour and say the same shit to everyone. Well, the thing that you want to do, which is going to really show that you care to the potential host, is say, hey, can you tell me anything that you know about, like, what do you know about your audience? What is it that they've told you that they like? What episodes that you've published so far have done really well? Which ones have very high listener counts? Because what you want to do is you want to say, look, I want to understand how I can take this thing that I've got and make it really compelling and relevant to the people that you specifically have in your audience. So this is ultimately what positioning is just taking what you've got and aligning it to what somebody needs or what understanding of the world that they have and so on and so forth. So when you on a podcast, instead of just saying, hey, here's us, Array Digital's journey to 100 million, here's our story. If you're talking to a bunch of web designers, or the podcast is listened to by web designers, you maybe describe your journey and what you've taken away and stuff in a way that applies to them. I mean, it makes perfect sense, but a lot of people don't unfortunately do this. The big thing is, at the end of every episode, whenever you go on somebody's podcast, there will inevitably be some variation of this question, which is, where can people find out more about you? The number one thing that people say is typically, go to wfreelancing.com or writemessage.com or say hi to me on Twitter or email me or something like that. But that's not a good call to action. And you see this a lot with guest posts, you see it on podcasting and so on. What I like is if you have this asset that you're using to get yourself on a podcast. So say I talk for 30 minutes about pricing theory. At the end of that conversation, I can say, yeah, so honestly, best way to follow up with me is if you want to dive deeper than I could in the span of this 30 minutes into this topic, go check out freepricingcourse.com. It's a 9-lesson free course that will help you better understand and put into action what we just covered. And then get that damn domain. Get a really nice domain. I mean, I've got this freepricingcourse.com, that's not fake, that's mine, that redirects to my site to an opt-in page. So whenever I go, if I'm on a stage and I'm talking about pricing at a conference, let's say, or I'm on a some sort of podcast interview or whatever else, I have this vanity domain that is very easy to remember. Now I've seen variations of this, like lead pages by lead digit or lead digits by lead pages. There's a bunch of other alternatives that give you this ability to like text whatever as a way of effectively opting into an email list. So you text this number, it replies back with what's your email, you give it your email, and then it'll push it into their email service provider. This is basically the same thing, but that'll just redirect people to an opt-in page. And that's when I shared the 40 to 80 people a day, most of them are hitting this through this massive backlog of appearances that I've made over the last few years. So after the recording's finished, ask if you can be intro to anyone. Basically, if this is a host who's interviewed somebody else who also has their own podcast and so on and so forth, use that to your advantage. Use that relationship that you now have to expand your own network and get in front of other audiences and kind of walk up that value ladder so that you can eventually be on some massive podcast that has 50,000 people listening an episode and so on.